Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Packaging Europe podcast. I'm your host, Victoria Hattersley, and today we're going to be talking about fashion, not couture, I'm afraid. So for anyone who's interested in that, you may need to direct your attention elsewhere. We're going to be asking what the fashion and textiles industry's biggest problems are when it comes to sustainable packaging and also where solutions might lie. So, to help me answer these questions, I've invited along someone with a little more specialist knowledge than me. So, I'm delighted to introduce Georgia Parker, who is the Innovation Director at Fashion for Good. For those of you who aren't familiar, I'm going to link to their website in the show notes, but their core mission, if I have this right, is to unite the fashion ecosystem to bring about positive change in all its facets. So welcome, Georgia, and thank you so much for speaking with me today. Is there is there anything else you'd like to add by way of introduction before we leap into the topic at hand?
Thank you. I think you gave a great overview of Fashion for Good. I think just to build on that, essentially what we want to do is scout, screen, and scale innovations across the whole supply chain. So materials, dyes, machinery, traceability solutions, sorting, recycling, packaging, circular business models, whatever it might be. And we work with innovators, brands, manufacturers, investors, ecosystem players, whoever is required to be able to make that happen. And a big part of our work is really around orchestrating collaboration to enable us to bring together all of these different partners to basically test and validate innovative solutions, both from a performance but also from an environmental impact perspective, and then see what are the roadblocks that we face as an industry to scaling these solutions and what role can we play to help unlock those roadblocks.
Okay, fantastic. So I thought we could begin on a subject that I know has been important for you guys. In fact, I've been reading a report you published on the topic, which I can also link to in the show notes for those interested. But it's the potential for reusable packaging models in the fashion industry and how these can bring about a real paradigm shift. And I mean, increasing uptake of reuse is a huge theme across the entire packaging sector, but why is it that reusable packaging models are perhaps still less prevalent in fashion today, while single use remains the norm?
Yeah, really good question. And I think before we dive into that, I just wanted to set the scene on how we look at packaging at Fashion for Good, and why it's really important to also have a cohesive approach to exploring different technology solutions. So our relationship with packaging started back in 2019, and we kicked off a big project in this space where we mapped what the different technology solutions that already existed and where there might be innovation gaps. And we identified three key levers to reduce virgin plastic waste. So the first one was reducing plastic through process innovation. So looking at automation within the DCs, seeing how we could reduce the amount of plastic waste at source. The second one was seeing how we could close the loop on existing plastics. And within that, we had two work streams. One that looked at building a circular poly bag. So, how could we recycle the current PE poly bags? And how could we incorporate higher percentages of recycled content into new poly bags? And then the second work stream looked at reusable packaging. So, how could we reduce the dependence on new plastics with scaling reusable packaging?
Mm.
The final lever was looking at how could we decouple from fossil fuels. So, exploring bio-based solutions, looking if there's a way to use like greenhouse gas based feedstocks where you'd use carbon capture utilization or even advanced chemical recycling processes. So really then looking at how do we build out different validation projects in each of those areas. So we ran a project that looked at closing the loop on poly bags, and we were able to produce recycled poly bags with Cadell de-inking, who were later bought by the Irma Group. Then we also ran a polybag collection pilot at selected London stores. We, as you said, produced a report looking at some of the levers around reusable packaging. And finally, the last project that we have in this space has been around compostable polybags And that project is due to wrap up in the next month or so. So I think when we look at all of the different work that we've done across recycled, recyclable, compostable, reusable packaging over the last 5 years, I think what's been really interesting is there is no best fit or one size fits all when it comes to packaging solutions. It's really dependent on a couple of different factors. So the first one is that the local infrastructure matters. So compostable packaging works where they might have the correct composting infrastructure in place, but you also need to be able to have collection and logistics if you're looking at reusable or recyclable. You need to really think about what the end destination is. If their packaging is mainly B2B, then there's lots of opportunity to leverage reusable packaging because you have a nice closed loop process where you can effectively capture that reusable packaging, get it sent back to the provider, and have that quite a streamlined process. Or, for example, if you were looking at creating a pure collection stream for recycled or recyclable packaging, obviously it's much easier if you were collecting polybags or packaging at the DC, for example, rather than at the consumer level, to be able to get that pure waste stream for recyclability.
Yeah.
The third point is really also, being clear on what problem you're solving for. Is it that you want to solve for the feedstock? So is it that you want to move away from virgin feedstocks? Is it that you want to solve for end of use? You want to avoid packaging ending up in landfill, and being really clear on what your goal is. And then I think the big learning has been stickers can throw a spanner in the works. So oftentimes you might have something that's 100% PE or is compostable, and then the poly bag or packaging has a sticker on it, and that really impacts either the recyclability or compostability. So we also need innovation in sticky labels, and as well as educating people on removing these labels before they put them into the relevant bin. So I think they're just some learnings that we've seen in the space. And I think really also consumer education is so important when it comes to correctly handling the different disposal methods of packaging. And I think specifically to your question on reusable packaging, where that works really well is where you have a good return rate, where you have a good education process on the importance of returning those items, where you make it easy for whoever it is that needs to return those items to send them back. Otherwise, it can become challenging to assess the positive environmental impact of that reusable packaging, because obviously from an environmental impact perspective, if it took more materials to make that product and it's only used a handful of times, then it might actually not be better overall. But happy to dig into any of that in more detail.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously that it's hugely complex, isn't it? And that was going to be one of the questions I asked you, whether you thought it was if any of these in particular stood out as being the most viable. But as you say, it's as with most things, it tends to be on a case-by-case basis. So I suppose with consumers, the key is always to make things as simple for them as possible, isn't it? And I was interested when you were talking about the particular problem with labels. Have any kind of solutions to that as yet sort of stood out to you?
It's a really interesting question. So I don't think there are that many solutions in terms of actual adhesives, but what we've seen some of the innovators that we're working with who are building like a compostable poly bag, they've been able to mitigate these issues through using compostable Ziploc poly bags rather than using adhesive strips, which can then obviously also be reused more times than you might otherwise be able to with those that are using adhesive strips. But it's definitely still a challenge. And the solution might be that you just need to make sure people rip the adhesive strip off or rip the label off before they put it either into the recycling or into their normal waste bin. But this comes back again to the importance of consumer education, and the consumer education also will be different depending on, as I said at the start, what the local infrastructure is. So what you're wanting to educate a consumer on in the Netherlands might be very different than it would be in New York or in London, because it might be that they have better recycling infrastructure in one of those countries than one of those cities than the other, or they might have industrial composting facilities where that bio-based packaging can flow into.
Okay, thank you. And have you seen or kind of worked with any particularly kind of successful, in your opinion, or innovative reusable packaging producers or systems that you would like to highlight? Maybe kind of recent startups that have caught your eye?
Yeah, for sure. I think the one that we have in our ecosystem and our alumni network is Returnity, who are based in the US. They sell reusable boxes, bags, and envelopes, and a big focus is around producing customized B2B packaging.
Mm.
For them, they really feel like what they're catering to is the circular adjacent economy. So that's where customers who have the element of circularity inherent in their process. So, for example, they've just launched an initiative with the apparel company Vuori, where they'll use the company's last box, a reusable shipping box that basically will enable Vuori to ship inventory fulfillment and merchandise shipments to different retail stores to replace conventional cardboard boxes. And then obviously they'll be then able to send that back to the DC, who will then refill those boxes. So from that perspective, for Returnity, they really see that there's a lot of value in what I was describing as these B2B ecosystem infrastructure, where it's quite easy to be able to get that box used multiple times to then get the benefit of the number of reuse times. Another example of that is, for example, Newly, who are obviously maybe not obviously, sorry, they are a rental platform that is part of the Urban Outfitter Group. And what they've done is they basically built out, a rental platform in the US that has multiple brands that are part of that platform. People can rent products either on a monthly basis or whatever it might be, one off, or selecting multiple items. And they have developed their own reusable packaging. And obviously, there you're getting that closed loop ecosystem where people would be sending back those clothes anyway. So it makes sense to use reusable packaging rather than single use platform. Another similar one is Her in the UK, where they've been utilizing reusables because, again, they're a rental platform, so their model really justifies it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've heard of Her actually. But I also wondered if in Europe, for example, in the EU, it becomes more complicated because there are so many different kind of regulatory standards to be aware of when you're, moving between countries. Have you noticed that becomes a bit more of a challenge?
Actually, not too bad. I think the European Union is fairly aligned. They've just announced this new legislation, which is the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive.
Yeah.
So I think from that perspective, they're relatively aligned in terms of like their requests, what good looks like on that front. And I think what will be really interesting to see is how we overcome some of the hurdles that we faced in scaling reusable packaging till now, before some of these requirements kick in by 2030. And I think there are still quite a few things that we need to collectively overcome as an industry and within this space in order to make it viable. So I think that's going to be really interesting over the coming years, because I think till now, one of the big challenges around reusable packaging has really been when you get engaged with the consumer on it, because I think that can sometimes be a disconnect between what the consumer says they would do and what they actually do. And it's not
Yeah.
for not of want of wanting to have the good intentions, but actually remembering to go and post back a parcel when you're really busy is sometimes really difficult to do. So I think that will be where in the next like 5 years or so, really understanding, and that's what I was saying at the start, what are the key application areas where recycled or compostable or reusable makes sense. And I think that it's important from a legislation perspective that it also takes into account these nuances of not just having one blanket solution without taking into account potential unintended consequences.
Okay. Sorry, thank you for that. I'm also wondering, and I should try to word this in a way that makes sense, but are there um are there specific challenges relating to reusable or recyclable packaging for the fashion sector that you wouldn't see in, for example, food, or is it less challenging in a way? Because obviously we're not talking about corrosive materials or anything like that, or anything that's going to kind of go off or spoil, or it's what are the differences there?
Yeah, I think a big difference is also, what's going into this packaging. So in the food space, if you already have food that's going to be on the packaging, then perhaps in that instance, compostable packaging is really important because the packaging is already dirty anyway.
Mm.
And I think obviously in fashion, it's got clothes in it a lot of times, and those clothes have often being transported from other manufacturing countries like Asia, or other countries in Europe, maybe like Italy and stuff like that. And so it has to be fairly durable in terms of protecting the garments. And I think it's been really interesting to see how different companies have tried using other materials over the years. For example, there was a pilot that was done, a few years back, where using paper packaging instead. And actually, what happened was that the products got damaged in transit, and in the DC. And that meant actually, obviously, the impact of having a damaged product was far greater than it was having the plastic packaging. So I think that that's where you need to think about the nuances of what you're solving for, and really understand that, like, okay, actually, it has a certain job to do, and the job is to protect the clothes. And the manufacturing of clothes or shoes or whatever it might be is hugely impactful. And in the fashion supply chain, actually, the biggest environmental impact is at the material production stage. So you then obviously want to make sure that any packaging you are using does its job in terms of protecting that garment from the point that it leaves the facility to the point that it ends up at the end customer. And so I think for that's also really important too. And I'm sure also overlaps with the food space. Obviously, you want to make sure that the food is protected and lasts, but I think it's slightly different nuance in terms of like the supply chain and the time to the final store.
And in terms of the retailers or retail platforms, are there any large or small that you think are performing particularly well when it comes to embracing either reusable or recyclable packaging and working it into their system? And also, perhaps, do you see any difference between kind of high-end brands and the sort of more affordable, in quotes, brands, or is there no real difference?
On the reusable packaging front, there aren't really any brands that are using reusable packaging, um, or the bigger brands, there aren't really any that are using reusable packaging for a usual purchase, right? So when you buy something from ecom, and then there's no like return moment like there would be with like a rental platform or anything like that. On the recycled packaging front, a lot of them have made commitments, and actually there's a lot of solutions already available that are already at like 90% recycled content that you can already purchase on the market. And that was also the pilot that we ran with Cadell de-inking that was looking at how you could remove the inks from the poly bag as well, so that you could retain the transparency required for a poly bag. And as I said at the start, Cadell de-inking were purchased by the Irma Group in December 2022, and now their poly bags and their innovation is widely used within that organization. So I think pretty strong on recycled content targets already across the board, which is good. And I don't think too much of a difference in that regard. I think where it gets quite interesting is around the customer experience. And I think for luxury players, obviously the packaging is part of that experience. And so I think oftentimes you might see that, it arrives in like a nicer box or something like that, because it's part of your overall purchase of that product. You're not just buying the product, you're also buying that journey that you go on. And I think we're also seeing, a lot of brands, wherever feasible, trying to use paper packaging. I think that oftentimes that can make sense for the packaging from the DC to the consumer. So where the products have arrived in the poly bags and then they're being put into mailer bags, that can often then be, paper packaging rather than plastic packaging. I think what's another consideration, everything has a ripple effect, right? And I think also if you're using paper packaging, need to be mindful that you're not using any paper that's come from trees from endangered forests. So a lot of the brands would also ensure that they were using FSC certified paper, or they've made commitments to Canopy, who have they're another ecosystem organization who really advocating for moving away from using endangered forests for either paper or for the fashion industry. So that's also really great to see. And I think seeing innovation in terms of how you can again come back to like, what is your strategy depending on like where that garment is on its journey, and identifying like where you might be able to use alternative materials outside of plastic is really exciting to see.
And do you think you're also seeing a kind of move away from over packaging as well? I think we've all kind of in the past been sent boxes of things with ludicrous amounts of packaging and things wrapped within things, like you feel like you're playing a game of pass the parcel with yourself or something. Do you think that we're kind of moving away from that now?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's also great to see as well, that a lot of the strategies that these brands have in place are also, if I come back to those 3 levers that I talked about at the start, our work has predominantly been around like closing the loop through circular poly bags or reusable packaging or decoupling from fossil fuels. But the other lever was looking at how you can reduce plastic through process innovation. And that's really about like, how can you reduce the amount of packaging materials that you need? And I think what's also been really interesting through the pilots that we've been running is understanding, what's, as you say, like a value add to the consumer and what's necessary for the flow of products through the DC. And I think that actually transparency is really important, because the way that the belts work in the DC is that the poly bag would go along it. Someone would want to be able to scan the label through the poly bag, and then it gets sorted or it gets processed. So being able to have that transparency is really important, to be able to capture the relevant data through the barcode that you're scanning. And I think that's also been one of the things that we've been exploring with the bio-based packaging pilot that we've been running, is what is the sweet spot in terms of bio content, whilst also being able to maintain the necessary standards required for the polybag to do its job. And I think that comes back to, is it the polybag which goes around the garment, or is it like a mailer bag that the products go into? And I think with the mailer bag, there's a bit more flexibility in terms of what it looks like, what the material is, versus for a poly bag, it has to be transparent. Otherwise, you can't run the process. So I think that's also been really interesting.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Now, apart from what we've already discussed, I'd like to maybe briefly step back and look at some wider questions, because although packaging is obviously very much our wheelhouse, everything's related, and I think we can often learn valuable lessons from other parts of the fashion value chain. So I'd kind of, if you could give me your thoughts on the possibilities for textile recycling, for example, such as that developed by Renewcell. I don't know if you're happy to talk about them.
Yeah, for sure. So I think Renewcell were the first pioneer innovator who really got they had to really pave the way for a lot of other innovators behind them. And I think that because they were publicly listed, they also were under an incredible amount of scrutiny in terms of their reporting requirements. And I'm really pleased that they have now been bought by Alta Investments, and they're now operating under the Circulose name. And I think it's fabulous to see that there are commitments being made both with the manufacturers and the brands to continue to buy the Circulose material and get it into the market. But I think if I take a step back and think about like the fiber basket, and then I can dive into some of the learnings around scaling textile to textile recycling. We did an exercise where we basically mapped what the current fiber basket is today. And today, what we would define as next gen materials. So that includes textile to textile recycling, that includes biosynthetics, it would include materials made from algae, that sort of thing, make up less than 1% of the total basket. So it's barely anything. And we did some modeling where we looked at our innovators' projections, we looked at other innovators' projections, we looked at existing manufacturers' projections, and we modeled out that by 2030, we anticipate that next gen materials could make up 13% of that total fiber basket. And that's predominantly driven by textile to textile recycling of cellulosics and polyester. So that's, hopefully we surpass that volume. But I think really what we've seen over the last 6 months or so is that the road to scaling these material solutions, such as textile to textile recycling, is not straightforward. And we see that there is engagement that needs to happen both at the brand level, the manufacturer level, the innovator level, and also at the ecosystem level. And some of the things that we're seeing are challenges for the brands and the retailers are seeing consistent performance at scale. So ensuring that this material meets the necessary performance requirement. Another challenge we've seen is around supply chain integration. So how do you implement this new innovation into your existing manufacturing supply chain? It often takes a lot of collaboration for a manufacturer to understand how this different material or pulp or pellet works.
Because I assume they're not necessarily drop-in solutions most of the time.
No, and I think oftentimes we probably would say, oh, it's drop-in because chemically it's the same if you looked at the polymer structure. But obviously with any new material, it's always going to need tweaks. And I think that's also where really the manufacturer's role is so important, because they have all of this expertise when it comes to scaling these different materials, and they also need to understand like how to make it work in their process.
Yeah.
And then another big challenge is around like the price premium and the ability to absorb cost increases when it comes to materials, and that's both on, you know, materials for apparel, for footwear, but also for packaging, right? How much are they willing to pay? And I think what we're seeing increasingly, but has perhaps been lacking a little bit, is brands having a clear innovation roadmap where they're making long-term commitments to this, utilize these innovative and next-gen materials. But equally on the recycler side, oftentimes they've struggled with access to feedstock. A lot of their processes are require specific types of feedstock with very high either cellulose or polyester content. The capacity to process things like elastane is often fairly limited. And I mean, if you check the label of your clothes and what you're wearing today, most of the time people's clothes are made from a blend of materials. And then if you layer on top of that the fact that you have things like buttons or zippers or whatever it might be, you know, a little bit of a trim on that jumper, all of these are like contaminants which can mess up the process. So there's a huge amount of prep that needs to happen before a recycler can process textile waste feedstock. And also they're building these huge new facilities that require funding, right? It's
Huge investments,
oftentimes
isn't it?
huge investments that are needed, and really helping the finance industry see the opportunity there is something that is happening increasingly, but it hasn't been a space that they've maybe necessarily invested in the past. So there's a lot of education required there. But I think we're really excited to see the traction that the likes of Circ, who do blends, textile recycling, also Syra and Ambercycle, who do polyester recycling, and of course the purchase of Renewcell, now called Circulose by Ulta, that that we see that there is traction happening in this space. But really what we need is collaboration and alignment, both internally and externally, for brands and manufacturers. We really need all of the departments within a brand to be singing from the same hymn sheet. Otherwise, it's really difficult as you make that jump to scale up material volumes if you don't have product development and design on the same page as sustainability and innovation. And we also need the right incentives. So we need a little bit of carrot, we need a little bit of a stick, and really learning from industries like renewables and electric vehicles to see what worked there to enable scaling. And how do we also build an infrastructure that enables us to capture the right textile waste feedstock? I think in Europe, they've done a fabulous job at building out bottle collection schemes in the packaging space. How can we replicate that also in textiles, or even in poly bags and things like that? So yeah, exciting times.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that the kind of the similarities between different situations, because the reason I asked is I was having we in the packaging industry face almost the exact same problem with trying to scale novel feedstocks like algae or anything, and sourcing materials. And it's I was having a very similar discussion with somebody about that applied to packaging rather than textiles recently. So it is very analogous problems and bottlenecks that both industries face.
Yeah, and I think what's also really interesting is, you know, if you put policy and regulation in place, we also need to make sure that the necessary supply is there, right? Because if you put the policy in place and we haven't been able to scale up the volumes, then there's going to be a race to the finish to get hold of that volume, which will then bump the price up even more than it already is for using these innovative materials. And I think another interesting lever is how you can decouple the price from the actual feedstock, or essentially oil prices, right? Because I think sometimes what happens is if the oil price drops so low, it's so hard for these other innovations to compete, because they're competing with something that's you know, on the floor in terms of those prices. And I think that's where legislation can be really impactful. If you look at things like extended producer responsibility, where you have to pay like a tax or a charge if you use single-use packaging or you use virgin materials, and you utilize that money to then reinvest into the solutions. Because I think that's what we've seen is really challenging, right? Is that oftentimes these innovative materials, either in packaging or in textiles, are being compared to a conventional material that not only is super cheap, but also has been around for a really long time, so is really efficient, right? And so that's also what some of our work at Fashion for Good is doing, is really exploring what are different financing mechanisms that we could maybe leverage that would enable us to try and absorb the premium as we get economies of scale. So that's also a lot of our work as well.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to, I can see we're kind of moving towards the end of our time now, but I really did want to also, if it's okay, take advantage of your expertise a bit to provide our listeners with some practical advice, perhaps. So I was wondering, what do brand owners and retailers need to consider when they're choosing their packaging, and how can they get it right from a sustainability perspective?
Yeah, I think what I would say is really thinking about having a different strategy for all of the different types of packaging that you use. So, and maybe it ends up being, okay, you're committed to using recycled content, but not presuming that it's a one size fits all. And I think that comes back to the things that I talked about at the start, you know, really understanding like what does local infrastructure look like? What's the end destination? You know, what are potential unintended consequences of implementing a new solution? And what are some of the, what I would call in inverted commas, contaminants like adhesive strips, stickers? How does all of that impact it? And I think there's a really great example of like where it's just really difficult sometimes to get a solution that works for everyone. Inditex and Zalando actually had an interesting engagement on this topic, because Inditex have committed to removing single-use plastic packaging in the supply chain, but Zalando, who sell Inditex's products on their platform, had said that they weren't able to do that. And so I think it's also really interesting to see, and that's not because they don't want to. Zalando also have big commitments around packaging, but they also understand that actually it's maybe not as nuanced as just saying, okay, we'll get rid of all plastic packaging, because it comes back to, again, like the functionality through their processes, and also thinking about the environmental impact of these different solutions. So I think that's a really great example where I know both of them are leaders in this space, but even between them, there was maybe, you know, differing approaches and opinions on what their commitments were. And so navigating that where they interact together, I think is really exciting to see.
Yeah, and I guess it's very rare to get it right first time as well, isn't it? I think it's another
Yeah, and I think that's a
important.
really interesting point. I think when it comes to sustainability and innovation, particularly sustainability, there isn't much room for trial and error. I think that if you know, brands come out with capsule collections, or, you know, particularly new product line, understandably so, there's a lot of like analysis and, you know, digging into the nuances behind these different solutions and technologies. And I think that's really important to do. But I think it can make it difficult, because actually the way that you learn and iterate is by trialing and failing, and then dusting yourself off, getting up again and trying again. And I think that sometimes, because obviously the environmental and social impact of the world is on the line with some of these decisions, it can be quite difficult to have that space for iterating and testing. But I think what's been great to see is over the last like 7 years that we've been running Fashion for Good is we've really worked collaboratively with all of our partners to really hone in on what are the things that we're looking for when we're looking for new solutions in this place, and understanding the unintended consequences of materials and not taking something at face value. And I think by doing that, and then by being able to validate them through the projects and pilots that we run, both from a performance and impact perspective, we build a good education base from which partners can then make strategic decisions on where they feel they should invest.
Yeah, great. And as you say, I think it's important that brands are able to have kind of a safe space, or do feel able to say, we tried something, it didn't work, and be honest about that and why it didn't work, and be able to share that information, which I think is something we're seeing increasingly across many sectors. And that's a really positive thing, I think, rather than just hiding any kind of perceived failures because it doesn't look good for the brand, which doesn't really help anyone move forward.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also comes back to having an open communication channel with customers and consumers, and helping them understand, if you are using different types of packaging, be it reusable, be it recycled, be it compostable, be it paper, that the consumer also knows what to do with that packaging. And sort of a bit of a sidestep, but we just did a analysis of assessing textile waste volumes and composition in the US, and we've done similar projects in Europe and India. And we also did a consumer education study, and it was really interesting to see that often people don't know what to do with their stuff, particularly stuff that like isn't really what a charity shop is going to want to resell, right? And so I think that's also where education is really important, so that people know, okay, well, actually these locations would take your garments regardless of the state they're in, because there are avenues to downcycle that into rags or whatever it might be, and it's better to do that than it is to put it in the bin and it end up in landfill. So I think that's also where like this open narrative with the consumer is really important.
Okay, thank you. Really important points. Sadly, I think that's all we have time for today. As I said, I will post links to your organisation so our listeners can learn more. And in the coming weeks, we're also going to be publishing a report on the membership section of our website, which will cover a lot of the topics from this discussion and go into more detail. So only remains me to say thank you so much, Georgia. I really, really enjoyed our talk, and I hope you'll speak to us again in the future.
Thank you very much for having me, and
Welcome.
I am very happy to answer any follow-up questions, and I think it's a really exciting topic and space. So looking forward to seeing the report.
Definitely. Okay, until next time, have a good day, everyone.